Everybody, here we are on our final day of day 2 of the Start of the Year Summit. And thanks for joining us. If you're just joining us for the first time, hello again, everyone. I'm Frank Gruber. I'm the co-CEO of Established and the company that powers the Start of the Year program and the Summit. So to round out the day, I'm thrilled to be joined by Whitney Johnson. Before we get started with that, though, I want to make sure if you're watching right now, join the conversation on Twitter. Use the hashtag Startup of Year and disrupt yourself. Share your favorite thoughts, quotes, questions, photos, and we'll be giving away some copies of her latest book, our next guest's latest book, Disrupt Yourself, for our favorites. So be ready for that. Next up, we've got Whitney Johnson. She's the CEO of WLJ Advisors. She's an executive coach, a speaker, innovative thinker, was recently named one of the most influential management thinkers by Thinkers 50. She's the author of a number of books, including Build an A-Team, and the critically acclaimed Disrupt Yourself. I have both right here. As well as she's a former Wall Street analyst and was the co-founder of the Disruptive Innovation Fund. And they've invested in a number of companies, including at least one unicorn. She also does a weekly Disrupt Yourself podcast and shares her thoughts online on both a personal blog as well as on LinkedIn, and has accumulated over 1 million followers. I think she's up to almost 2 million followers already on that platform. So welcome, Whitney. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Frank, I'm so happy to be here.
Great. Really appreciate it. I know you're super busy, so let's just dive right in. You started in Wall Street, getting into Wall Street and being kind of an analyst and investment banker. How did you get into that to begin with?
Okay, let me see if I can give you the Reader's Digest version. So I actually studied music in college, and I play piano. And when I graduated from college, I knew I didn't want to do music. I had gotten married, and yes, I got married in college. My husband and I, we both moved to New York. He's getting his PhD at Columbia, and he has a stipend of like $14,000 a year. So we need food on the table, and I have to go out and get a job. Because I'm a music major, I've never set foot in a business course. I have no job to get other than being a secretary. So my first job was as a secretary to a stockbroker at 1345 Avenue of the Americas, because you always remember the address of your first job. And so I would go to work every day. This was 1989, so it was really exciting, like Liar's Poker and Bonfire of the Vanities and Working Girl. And so every day I'm going to work, and there's these stockbrokers, aspiring masters of the universe, and they'd say things like, throw down your pom-poms and get in the game. And at first I'm kind of offended because I was a cheerleader in high school, but I hear that so many times, I realize it's time to throw down my pom-poms. And I would not have known to call it this end, but that was the beginning of me disrupting myself, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But that was the beginning, as I started taking courses at night, and eventually had a boss who moved me from being a secretary to a banker. And so my career on Wall Street began. Very circuitous.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So you worked your way up, and you ended up being an investment banker and doing pretty well at it as well.
Yeah, I did.
And so let's talk about, you mentioned it briefly there, but let's first define disruption, and then we'll kind of dive into that point you mentioned, which is how do you disrupt yourself?
Yeah, so disruptive innovation, it's a term that was coined by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. And at its simplest, it's a silly little thing that eventually takes over the world. Like the telephone did to the telegraph, like the automobile did to the horse and buggy. And more recently, we've seen Netflix disrupt Blockbuster, now cable TV. Uber's disrupting cabs, and I suspect there are a number of companies that are listening to this conversation that we're having who are trying to disrupt their industries. And so that's what disruption looks like for a product or a service. Personal disruption is how you take all these ideas and make them meaningful to you. The big difference, of course, is that with personal disruption, you are Netflix and Blockbuster, you're Uber and cabs, you're this silly little thing, and you take over the world because you are disrupting you.
So why is disrupting yourself so important?
Great question. So people ask me that a lot. And the reason it's important is if you're working in an environment where there's a lot of disruption, there's a lot of upheaval happening, there's this sense of, oh my goodness, I can't deal with this. There's too much happening. I'm going to drown in all this disruption. The only way that you don't drown in the disruption, whether you're an individual or as a company, but certainly it starts with the individual, is that you disrupt yourself, because you're basically saying, I am an agent, and that is the one thing I have control over. And if you, as an individual, are continually disrupting yourself, stepping back from who you are to slingshot into who you can be, then you're in a position where the disruption's happening around you, but you're not drowning in it, you're riding that wave.
So you're literally riding this wave through, and yeah, that's, I mean, that's a great way to put it. So I guess how would you get started with this? Like, if I was like, oh, you know what, I'm gonna disrupt myself tomorrow, what would the first step be for me?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is to just be aware of it, and this notion of disruption, that you can disrupt yourself. The second thing I would say is, okay, so I want to do something different tomorrow than what I'm doing today. I want you to think about the fact that every single person's on an S curve. And so this is the second big aha that I had when I was working with Clayton. By the way, we didn't mention that I co-founded that Disruptive Innovation Fund with Clayton.
Right.
So
Yep.
I had this aha that disruption is not just about products, it's about people. Second big aha, as we were using the S curve to invest, I thought, you know what, this can also help us understand how we learn, basically a mental model for how we grow. So every time you start something new, you're at the bottom of that S, the bottom of that wave, but then you put in the effort, you move into the sweet spot where things are hard, but not too hard. And then you get to the top where things are easy and you know exactly what you're doing, but because you're no longer enjoying the feel-good effects of learning, you can get bored. And so you've got to jump to a new S curve. So you learn, you leap, and you repeat, you get to the top, you disrupt yourself. And the reason that you do this, in addition to riding that wave, is that we as human beings are wired to learn. And so when we recognize that and acknowledge that, now we've got this model for, oh, this is why when I was on that job and I had to leave that job and everybody thought I was out of my mind, it's because I was at the top of my S curve. Now I have.
And you were bored, right? Like, at the end of the day, it just wasn't interesting anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
You've got this explanatory mechanism for why you've done some of the things that you have done.
Right, that makes sense. All right. So in the book, you talk about risk. And so can we talk a little bit about, there's different types of risk, and obviously leaving that job is one of those risks, I guess you could say. What are they? What are the different types of risks, I guess you could say, and how do you get prepared for taking those risks?
Yeah. So one of the things we identified were 7 accelerants of personal disruption. The first accelerant is taking the right risks. And at its basics is there are 2 kinds of risks that we talk about. There's competitive risk and there's market risk. So competitive risk, and you are all familiar with it, is there's an opportunity, you've got the projections to prove it. You just have to figure out if you can compete and win. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Market risk is you don't know if there's an opportunity, but if there is, there's no competition. And according to the theory of disruption, your odds of success are significantly higher when you take on market risk, even though it's not quite as certain. So what does that look like for you as an individual? Well, it means that instead of always going after the job where there's 50 people applying and you know there's a job, you say to yourself, well, I think that there's a problem that needs to be solved, and I think I can solve it. And if you can persuade someone to hire you to do it, there's not 50 applicants, there's you. And so you're figuring out ways to create market risk or take on market risk versus competitive risk. And to simplify it even further, it's this idea of you're thinking about how can I create versus compete. Amateurs compete, professionals create. And so that's what I mean when I talk about taking the right kinds of risks. It raises your odds of success.
Right. That makes sense. And I think you even mentioned, like, and this might have, I don't know if this was in the context of yourself or in a like a competitive environment with a company, but kind of staying under the radar a little bit could be a competitive thing to do, a good thing to do. Can you say why? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're a disruptor, you think about what is a disruptor. It's a silly little thing. It's almost like a toy. And so it's very simple. And one of the things that's helpful is if you stay under the radar, no one's aware of you. It's sort of this stealth operation where you're able to go into the marketplace, even you as an individual, and start to figure out, sort of assess your surroundings, start to iterate, start to practice, test it, so that by the time you're ready to, or by the time that people know about you and competitive risk starts to be a thing, if you think about sort of the low end of the launch point of that S curve, people could squash you like a bug. But if no one's aware of you, then you're able to iterate to the point that once you get into this steep part of the curve and competition comes on, you've started to get your business model or whatever it is you're trying to move forward, whether as an individual or as a company, you've got it refined to the point that you can now compete successfully.
That makes a lot of sense. And you see that a lot with startups, right? Starting in that stealth mode. Some bigger companies go big splash to begin with, and sometimes that doesn't work. Yeah, I've seen even more recently, there's been a couple of companies that have tried that and it doesn't seem to work quite as well. Okay, let's talk about constraints. In business, there's definitely a lot of different constraints. There's capital, there's time, there's invisible constraints, there's other constraints. How do you feel about constraints in business, and how can those constraints be used to your advantage?
Yeah, so it's so interesting that you mentioned that thing, that the comment about constraints and these large companies making a big splash. So we'll come back to that in a second. So the idea of constraints, we think that if I had more time or money or buy-in from the people around me, then I could, really move up that S curve more quickly. But it's a law of physics that you need something to bump up against in order to gain energy. And so you look at quick example, there was a post-mortem of 200 failed startups, and they divided them into the funded startups and the unfunded startups. The funded startups, the number one reason they went out of business was they ran out of cash. So this idea of some of these companies making this big splash, sometimes they have too many resources, and it was only the number 10 reason for the companies that were bootstrapped. And so we think that constraints are something that's holding us back, but I would argue, and the data would suggest, that in fact, the constraints are the very thing that we need to create. I mean, very simply, time, right? If none of us ever had to turn in a paper in school, would we have ever graduated? Probably not. So constraints are actually really, really essential to any sort of business building or creative process.
That makes sense. I mean, you definitely see that a lot with, the bootstrap companies that come out, they tend to, get stuff done, have a physical product that's out there being used by lots of different people, as opposed to the other method, which is, come up with the idea and try to get a lot of capital behind it and whatnot.
Yeah.
We've seen both. All right. So you mentioned another, do you want to loop back to the big company, or can we move?
Oh, I did. The fact that sometimes I think they make a big splash and they have too much capital available to them.
Got it. Yeah.
There aren't the constraints imposed where they have to do something. It's something Clayton always said when we work together, is you need to be patient for growth and impatient for profits. I think that's really important, and the importance of him. If you don't have constraints, then impose them, because you actually need them in order to move up that S curve.
Oh, that makes sense. All right, let's move right along here. There's so many great topics. I just want to kind of keep shifting through. So let's talk about entitlement. One that could be of culture, emotional, financial, intellectual. How does entitlement impact us all? And maybe give some examples, and maybe what can we do or leverage it or learn from it to kind of help us disrupt ourselves?
Yeah. Okay, this is one of those topics that we could talk about for many hours. It's a sneaky saboteur of any sort of S curve climb. It shows up when everything's working in your business. You're like, margins are expanding, revenue growth accelerating, my team's humming. And so we start to think this is the way things will and should always be. And so then we stop asking those crucial questions that will allow us to continue to innovate. But it also happens when you're a startup, for example, and things aren't working the way you want them to. And you're like, oh, well, it's the investor's fault. It's the customer's fault. It's everybody's fault except for me figuring out how to take the right risks and play to my strengths and embrace the constraints that I have. Another way that it can show up is when we start saying, things start being successful, and we start, what do I want to say? We start to lapse back into our addiction to being right. So what do I mean when I say that? We all like to be right. Whenever we argue with someone and win, our brain floods with adrenaline and dopamine. And so we feel dominant and invincible. And so the next time we disagree with someone, we argue again because we're addicted to being right. Well, so what does that do? Well, when we are have to be right, then we're always competing with everyone. We're competing with our customers. We're competing with our investors. We're competing with our team members because we have to be right. And so in that competition, instead of taking the disagreement, which is a constraint, and turning that disagreement in something that we create, we're competing. And you battle your entitlement when you don't have to be addicted, when you take that disagreement and you turn that into something that you can create out of it, create a new idea. So you're co-creating. So that's one of the ways that you can battle entitlement. Distilling it again, it's this idea of we treat every person, including ourselves, with dignity and with respect. It's a tough one, but it's really, I think it's the most important of all the 7 accelerants.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, and especially in this day and age. So I think interesting thing there is obviously looking at things more optimistically too, right? There's a little bit of optimism there about, rather than taking like if you hit a wall with like something, you don't stop and say it's this person's fault or that thing didn't work out. More about like, well, how do we turn this into a positive? How do we move on to the next thing, right? So I think it's really interesting, and I think I feel like more optimistic people are more successful. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems that way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, optimism believes that there's a way. You can find a way. We'll figure it out. And
Right.
and that's what optimism is, and pessimism is there's no way. Well,
Right.
To be an entrepreneur, I think you have to fundamentally be optimistic.
Definitely. Okay. Let's move on to risk. Risk is obviously part of everything you do. How do you approach risk, and how do you harness the power of risk to kind of empower yourself?
Yeah. So one of the things I think that's interesting about risk, I mean, when you make a decision to disrupt yourself, you're basically at the top of an S curve, and you're saying, do I jump or don't I jump? Do I do something new or don't I do something new? So one of the things that you want to be thinking about is, all right, well, I'm probably better off if I take on market versus competitive risk, which we talked about. But the second thing that I want you to think about really seriously is that we sometimes don't want to jump because we're afraid of the unknown. We don't know what the future will bring, and that feels quite frightening to us. What's interesting, though, is if you look at Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's research, they said that we're more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. So we're 2.2 times more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. So when we get to the top of an S curve and we know that we need to do something new with our business, with our life, et cetera, we think, oh, that looks scary. Well, one of the ways that we can kind of flip that on ourselves and say, all right, it's scary for me to jump, but what bad thing will happen to me if I stay here? And that can really motivate us and say, oh, well, if I stay here, then I might get pushed off. And I think I'd rather jump with a parachute than get pushed off. And so one of the ways that you can mitigate risk is, number one, take on market versus competitive risk. Recognizing that according to the theory, when you take on market risk, your odds of success are higher, and motivate yourself by thinking about what will you lose if you try to stand still. And those two things will get you to move forward. And then once you move, then there's momentum in that movement.
Interesting. I mean, the point you made about like you're more concerned about what you might lose. That keeps people stuck, right? I mean, you can't. That's a hard one. So I definitely see that. That's great advice. Okay, so one thing that I always like to do, and look at in my life is gratitude and thinking about the things that we have. I feel like gratitude is an important one. Probably one of my favorite things you kind of touched on in the book. Can you talk about gratitude and how taking a path of gratitude can help empower yourself when you're disrupting?
Yeah, absolutely, Frank. Oh, I'm so glad that you brought that up. So what's interesting about, we talked a minute ago about entitlement, and one of the other faces of entitlement is this belief that we are more or less important than people around us. And what I have found is that the only way through that when things are difficult or things have gotten easy is to be grateful. And the reason that we need to be, and let me give you an example. In 2012 was a very difficult year for me. I had my husband was diagnosed with cancer. He's okay, but he was diagnosed. My younger brother took his life. Business was very difficult, and financially we were in a very difficult place. I mean, it was a really tough year. And I'd always heard my entire life of, you need to be, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit, and kind of this sort of admonishing kind of tone of voice. And I realized in that year that in fact, I needed to be grateful because it was the only way through. I had a choice. Am I going to be bitter and be like, the person who's bitten by a rattlesnake and they get their limbs cut off? Or am I going to be grateful?
Wait, let's talk about the rattlesnake. Hold on. What was that about a rattlesnake?
Okay, yeah, there's more story. So there's this story told that I heard when I was, like in my 20s about these kids who were in a desert. Mm-hmm. Go out, they're in the desert, they're having this great time, they're in high school, and one of their friends gets bitten by the rattlesnake. Mm-hmm. And so then they're like, oh, she got bitten by a rattlesnake. Let's go chase that rattlesnake and let's go kill that rattlesnake. So they went, they killed the rattlesnake. And when they came back, the rattlesnake was dead, but now the venom had coursed throughout her entire system. And so she had to have a leg amputated. So they were bitter instead of trying to figure out how to solve the problem, how to be grateful. And so the gratitude's the only way through. And then the other thing is that when we're grateful for something, this goes back to your idea of optimism, we give that thing power. So if you talk about debt, you're going to get more debt. If you talk about building wealth and you talk about building a business and that you're grateful for everything that's happened on your business, then you're going to get more of that too. So it's bitter or grateful. It's believing everything that we have, we're grateful for, and whatever we're grateful for, we get more of. And so that is how we move through this sense of entitlement of being a victim, instead of saying, what am I going to do? How am I going to move forward? I'm grateful for what I have.
Yeah, I think it's great. Great point. And I love the rattlesnake example. I don't love that they lost their leg. I think that's terrible, but I think it's a great example of how that can be. 2020 has been a tough year, I mean, for a lot of people. And I think that's really important. Gratitude is a really important way to get through it. And going back to that point as well, is like, I think a lot of people think that there's this scarcity, like there's, if they don't do this thing, there may not be enough of this one thing or that one thing. But I feel like along those same lines, there's a bit of abundance in the fact that, there is enough, just keep working and there's probably going to be enough, So I think that's, I like to kind of hone in, especially with startups. All right. So
yeah, it's so important. And having been a stock analyst, the market's made out of people who are buying and selling. There's always someone who thinks it's a long, it's a short. So we get to choose. Are we going to be positive or negative?
Right.
Like
that makes sense.
There's always enough.
Right. Okay. So along the same lines, we'll switch gears a little bit. We'll talk about odds. Here at the Start of the Year Summit, there's 100 companies participating. We vet it down to 15 and then to 5, and then we pick the Start of the Year. Usually the great companies that all come through, we vetted already down from 1,000 to 100. So there's some great companies already coming through. And I want to talk about equal odds rule. So I think that's where I'm getting at with this, and kind of with a long detailed explanation here, but more or less, all these companies are coming through. What are the odds of them all being successful? Is that possible? I mean, is it, let's talk about what that equals odds rule says and how that might apply.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to have to help me because I haven't thought about this for a little bit. So here's what I remember. It's research by Rob Wilbank, and basically said that in a pitch competition, there basically was no difference between the finalists and the actual winner of that pitch competition. So the fact that they were there, the fact that they were capable of being there over time, there was no difference in terms of success. Like, you were just as likely to be successful if you were one of the finalists as if you were the actual winner. And I think that's really powerful. And it also reminds me of some research done by talked about in a book called The Formula. It's a professor at Northeastern. He talks about how looking at kids and going to college, and he says that the success is not based on the college that they went to. The success is based on the college that they were capable of going to and applied to, which is so powerful. And I think it's so encouraging for all the startups that are at this, part of this competition, because now you're like, well, if you were capable of being here, then that means your odds of being success for all of you are sort of equal. It just depends on now, what do you do next?
Totally. And that's what I was getting at. You need no help. That was exactly what I was getting to. So let's talk about failure now on a darker note.
Success to failure. Okay.
All right. So we're all over the board here. We'll come back. We'll bring it back. So how do you approach failure when you're disrupting yourself? Because obviously it's a process, right? So let's talk about disrupting yourself and how failure can impact it.
Yeah. So failure is another one of these things that I've been on this journey with. Some of them are more clear cut, like create, don't compete, and entitlement. Oh, difficult. Failure as well. I remember, because I'm a perfectionist, recovering perfectionist, and so I take failure hard. There's all this great research by Heidi Grant about how, the trouble with bright kids, and probably most of the people who are participating have been bright. So we get this identity of like, my company's a success, I'm a success. My company's a failure, I'm a failure. So we start to make what happens and the things that we do this referendum on our identity. What I am really working on and what I really advocate for in my work is to start to separate out your identity from the things that you do. You are fundamentally valuable regardless of what's happening with your business. And so one of the ways that we try to play that out, and you heard me as we were talking earlier, is if something doesn't work in your company, I didn't have the questions prepared, everybody, for the conversation. And I was like, what happened? And I realized, oh, I just need to not say, well, it's someone's fault. It's just what in the system didn't work so that we can improve the system going forward. So the failure, it's part of innovation. It's part of building a business. It's a constraint. It's a tool of creation. Only if, it's shame that actually limits our ability to disrupt. It's not failure. And so that's the thing I want everybody to take away from this. Not failure. We all fail all the time. It's shame that you attach, and that's when you allow it to become a referendum. So if you're struggling with that, and you probably all are to a little bit, to a certain extent, then just work on it. And over time, if you can have less and less shame attached to it, then the faster you're going to be able to rebound, the faster you're going to be able to iterate, the faster you can disrupt yourself, and the more likely you are to have a business that can be successful, because you can rebound from that failure ever more quickly.
Right. So that's a great point. And so it really is about the emotional response, right, to failure than it is about failure itself.
Well said.
Great way to put it. So, all right. So let's talk about now you're going to bounce back from your failure because you have no shame. But how do you, a lot of people have this mission, right? And a lot of companies that are successful have a mission that's bigger than the mission of the company, right? It's a why, right? And maybe it's an internal why in their heart, or maybe it's something within the company that they've created that is the why. So I guess, there's books about finding your why and all that. Let's talk about why is important. I'm not trying to say why a bunch of times in a row here, but help us figure out why is so important.
Why are you asking that?
Right.
The reason it's important is that it becomes an anchor for you, so that it helps you think about something that's bigger than you are, bigger than yourself. And so when something doesn't work, it's not just about you and your small little world. You're like, okay, that didn't work, but I have, 10 people who are relying on me in this business, and I have 100 people, I have 1,000 people, I have 1 million people's lives who I am trying to get better. And so this small little setback is inconsequential compared to why I am doing what I am doing. And so the clearer that we can get on that, then those things that don't work, they're like, okay, that's a data point. Now I can get better. I can get better faster. And so the why allows you to have that perspective to zoom out and say, oh yeah, that's just some small little thing. Instead of making it a mountain, it just becomes a molehill, and you just continue to plow forward.
That makes sense. And obviously building and growing along the way. So let's talk about you've seen a lot of different people probably in your lifetime. What are the kind of the characteristics of a disruptor that, you've honed in on?
Yeah. So going back to our 7 accelerants, and as well, you don't know, but we have a podcast. So we interview, lots of really interesting people. And so looking at the accelerants, what are some of the characteristics? There are people who are willing to, number one, take on market risk, to play where no one else is playing. We just interviewed Kara Golden for our podcast. All you entrepreneurs, is she part of the summit?
She kicked off our day.
Yes. Okay, we just interviewed her. Okay, so you heard her story when she first went to New York and got a job. I mean, like, she epitomizes what it means to play where no one else is playing. So you take on market risk. That's the first thing. Second thing that our characteristics are people who not only have strengths, because we all have strengths, but are actually aware of them and willing to use them, because sometimes we don't value the things that we do reflexively well. Third characteristics, we talked about it, that willingness to embrace our constraints. The constraint isn't, why did this happen to me? It's like, okay, what am I going to do with this? How can I create with this? Fourth is battling that sense of entitlement. Again, not why, but what, and things shouldn't be this way. They are what they are. Let's move forward. Gratitude for whatever comes our way. 5 is a willingness to pivot, to be nimble, to be agile, to step back, to slingshot forward, give failure its due, as we talked about, that resilience, that grit, that bigger picture. And then finally is being discovery driven, knowing what your why is, but then taking a step forward, gathering feedback and adapting. So to the ability to walk into ambiguity. So those are all characteristics of people who are capable of disrupting themselves. And again, you disrupt yourself because when you do, your odds of success are higher, which is all what we're trying to do is raise the odds that we will be successful in our business, but also successful in our lives and have happy lives.
Love it. I think I mean, you pretty much summed it up perfectly. Is there anything else you're working on you'd like to share right now with everyone that's listening?
I think the only thing I would say is if you're listening and you're intrigued by what we've talked about, go listen to the podcast episode with Kara Golden. And then we also have another episode that just dropped today with Sid and Shay McGee, who are Studio McGee, these really interesting entrepreneurs. They have a dream home makeover on Netflix, and they've got there's some great learnings there as well for you all as entrepreneurs. So I would go listen to these 2 podcast episodes.
Definitely. Loaded question for you. What's your favorite book you've published? You got a few. I've only got a couple in my hand. I only have 2 hands. So far we got Disrupt Yourself and Building an A Team. You got others as well.
Yeah. You know what? Dan Pink once said it's like asking you to choose between children. But I think I would go, given in context of the conversation that we're having right now, I would say Disrupt Yourself. Yeah.
There it is. Yeah. All right. So it's out there. Go check it out. Thank you so much, Whitney. We really appreciate it. If you want to get in contact with you, how would they do that?
Oh, well, like I said, you can listen to the podcast episodes. And then if you want to reach out to me, it's just wj@whitneyjohnson.com.
Okay. Thanks so much, Whitney. We really appreciate the conversation today with the Start With Your community. As everyone out there is trying to disrupt themselves, especially in this wild year. So it's the only way to grow. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Frank.